today I wanted to address just kind of if you are going to start the adoption process, what you really need to be open to and work through for yourself. Every once in a while, I get calls from people who are angry about a lot of things. Well, they're projecting it on everything that goes into the adoption process. And really what I think it is feeling a lack of control, especially coming from a place of maybe a lot of despair, maybe when their body failed them, or the fact that they don't have control over what a woman is doing with her body and as she would. And that it's hard. There's a lot of control you have to let go of. Here's a couple of things that if nothing else, I'm honest, right? And I would rather you go start this process with your eyes wide open rather than having this dream of this unicorn situation just magically appearing for you, which may happen, right? But here's the truth about adoption. There's a couple things you have to be okay with. One is you have to be okay with regular cigarette smoking and marijuana. You got to be okay with those two things. They are so prevalent, especially cigarette smoking. I'd say cigarette smoking, then marijuana. And if you are wanting to adopt a white baby or a biracial white baby, know that in this opioid epidemic that we are still very much in, it is a white problem. I would say about 85%, I'm making that statistic up, but I feel like that's what I've seen. About 85% of white birth moms or expectant moms are using opioids. So let's go back to cigarettes and marijuana. I'm not talking about one cigarette a week every once in a while, right? I'm talking about daily cigarette smoking, a lot. What I kind of think about is, I know my grandmas smoked throughout their pregnancy with my parents, and it used to be a thing. So if I can wrap myself around that, it makes it a little bit more okay. And yet when you read about it, it feels a little bit scary. In the world of adoption, we barely even consider cigarettes and marijuana as substance exposure. That's how common it is. It's just kind of a known that you're okay with that if you're going to go through the adoption process. And if you're not, one, either people won't work with you because it's not realistic, or two, they're happy to take your money, and they should let you know that you could be sitting on a list for years because you just won't be seeing a lot of situations that are a good fit for you. Okay, so that's one thing you really just need to wrap your head around before going in. The second thing, well, I touched upon opioids. Opioids is a white problem only. We don't see it spanning races. So if you are hoping for a white baby, or even if you're open to all races, it's a really good idea for you to research the effects of opioid exposure. My guess is it's not as bad as you think it is in your head. Now, I am no doctor. I am not making any claims. And we talked yesterday about who should be on your adoption team, and a doctor should be one of those people. But there's a lot of research online as well. And from what I have heard from experts in this field of adoption and medical drug exposure, all that, I don't even know what it's called, what they are called, but they're experts in this. Many times they're less concerned with opioid exposure than they are with whatever trauma is happening in the birth mother's life at the time, or in what's happening in utero. That seems to have a much bigger effect than the actual drug itself. What I have seen and what I have read and what I have come to understand, again, not making any claims, is that with opioid exposure, you can expect a 1 to 2 week withdrawal period that the baby goes through that from my understanding, is really hard to see. But then they come through that and they're very strong and resilient, as babies are, and they seem to be just fine. They seem to thrive. And if anybody has experience with this, please comment if you are comfortable doing so. Long term, what I understand is that perhaps they have a bigger chance of experiencing ADHD. Okay. I think a lot of children have that possibility anyways. I feel like that's one thing that we might be able to handle, but that's up to you. So I just want you knowing that, going through that. The next thing you have to be open to is open adoption. And that is an area that a lot of people have a lot of fear around when they're first starting. Now, what does open adoption mean? It could mean so many things. It could mean sending letters and pictures once a year, or maybe every 6 months, through your adoption agency, through the placing agency, with no identifying information shared. That's what it means at the very least, and you have to be okay with that. That's pretty much a requirement across the board with every agency that I have come across. And on the other end of it, it could mean spending holidays together or birthdays together. Usually, if that happens, if that side of things is going to happen, it usually takes years to build up that trust. What I find, and I'll break it down a little bit more, is one, when people first start, they have a lot of fears around it. And usually the fears are stemming from things like, is this birth mother going to come and try to take my child away? And the answer is no. It's a myth. It doesn't happen. It happens in movies, but it doesn't really happen ever. I shouldn't say ever. Nothing's that black and white, but it doesn't happen. Another fear is, oh, but what if she's a crack addict and we don't want to be around her? Well, if she's a crack addict, first of all, most likely you're going to know that before you even say yes to presenting to a situation. And if you do decide you're okay with that, then you set boundaries. You're a parent, and she chose you to keep her child safe, and that includes safe from her if she poses a threat. Most likely she won't. What I have found are that the people who come in with the biggest fear around openness are the people at the end of it who have the most open adoptions. I mean, I have stories about that, like literally hours of conversations about trying to help people get through this fear. And by the way, we send our families a book on open adoption, and we try to address this as much as we can. And now they go for yearly visits. And I do want to say that I'm seeing a couple things from when I first started 6.5 years ago that have become more common. Whereas when I adopted 8.5 years ago, almost 9 years ago now, gosh, it seems like yesterday, it was very common just to send pictures and letters. Although I'll tell you what, at the hospital, and I was one of those people with those fears. I was one of those people. And more than myself, my family was really fearful. And that's where that book that I suggested yesterday, In on It, can be very helpful, but also just continuing to educate our families. So what I found at the hospital, after I spent some time with her, after I've talked to her on the phone a couple times, which by the way, once you're matched, typically 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a phone call with that directly with your expectant mother, usually with somebody from the agency on the phone with you, but you will have direct contact. And then usually, depending on if there's enough time between the match and the birth, perhaps you'll go for a visit. And I highly suggest if you have that opportunity, you take advantage of that, because building that trust between you is so important, especially since she hasn't made her final decision yet. And then spending time at the hospital together. once you've gone through that together, typically you have built up a trust with each other and you get a sense of who each other are to your core. That happened with me, and to tell you the truth, the thought of actually putting pen to paper and putting something in an envelope and finding an address and getting a stamp and putting it in the mail, or even downloading pictures and email, it just too much for me. I was like, can we just text? This is much easier. It's on my phone. I can press send. It's all good. And I never had to have a conversation around boundaries. And what I find is that most people don't. So what I'm seeing is more common these days is that from the get-go, from the match, more and more families are able to have a direct connection with your expectant mother and text and phone calls to each other without the agency involved. And then at the next level, I'm finding more and more expectant mothers are given the option, are asked, what level of openness do you want? Does that include visits? And more situations that I'm reading are saying that they would like a yearly visit. Again, that's not something you have to be open to from the get-go, but I'm telling you this to start wrapping your head around that possibility and start working through those fears. Remember, I said that an adoption therapist is a really great idea to have on your team. This is one of those areas that you might want to talk through before you start the adoption process, is this idea of openness, of who is a birth mother, right? And that's another thing too. Once you start understanding and you're able to sit across from a woman who placed her child and hear from her and look at her and have a conversation with her and see yourself in her, all of a sudden some walls come tumbling down. Just to kind of recap, we talked about cigarette and marijuana exposure, opioid exposure, and openness in adoption and what that means. And those are a few things that you have to know and work through, among others, but those are 3 biggies before you start the adoption process. And only if you can wrap your head around that and if you're okay with those things, should you move forward.